Welcome to Birdsong with your host, Kayuta Kiora, exploring all things related to the path of shamanism, nature-based spirituality, truth-seeking, storytelling, awakening, health and wellness, earth-honoring traditions, ceremony, ritual, rites of passage, and of course, a remembering of the sacred ways. Hello, my fine feathered friends. Welcome to Birdsong. It's Caillou here, and in this particular episode, we have Leon Cossar joining us. Now, if I was to personally put language to Leon's bio, it would sound something like Leon is a mythologist, a storyteller, a poet, a wilderness rites of passage guide, amongst many other threads of that nature. But through the lens of Leon's true poetic nature, his bio takes on this richness and this aliveness, and it feels only right to honor that sparkle that resides deep within his soul that comes out through the glimmer in his eye and the sweet flicker of his mytho-poetic tongue. So, Leon is an outdoorsman, a burgeoning poet, a rascally storyteller, and he's an independent scholar of deep ecology, anthropology, and mythology. He's currently studying a master's in the Poetics of Imagination with Dr. Martin Shaw and leads online programs guiding people into the mytho-poetic conditions of their life. As Leon puts it himself, he was born in Big Sky Country and is a sixth-generation farmer's son. He grew up with dirt-spittin' larrikins, spinning yarns of brawny bushrangers and wide-eyed toothless shearers who were kings of the woolsheds and scrappin pub brawls. When the prison bars of school bent open, he flew from the parched textbooks and drought-riddled country upon the wings of an inner dream and calling to become a wilderness guide on the high seas and soaring mountains. As a wilderness rites guide, Leon leads rites of passage programs with youth, vision quests with adults, and as a death doula, he offers his services to the ones who are passing through. He writes, among other things, on the miraculous human pilgrimage from here to there and the questions we must ask ourselves to guide us in genuine ways toward our one day, all at once, full arrival and disappearance. Wow, so it was such a pleasure to have Leon on the show, and I really enjoyed delving into the mythopoetic landscape, delving into storytelling, mythology, poetry, vision quest, wilderness immersion, and all the rest of it. I'm still sitting with one of the reframes that he offered me in our conversation, a reframe to a question that I have been sitting with for quite some time now, and like he himself puts it, an arrow to my heart indeed, and it's something that I will carry with me for many moons to come, no doubt. I'll leave it at that for now, and I trust that you will find value in our dialogue surrounding storytelling, mythology, poetry, and wilderness connection. And I trust that you will be able to carry the gemstones found within this dialogue with you on your own path forward. Leon, it is really just such a delight to sit down with you and have this conversation and to learn from you. You know, I can feel us. We're both preparing. Well, at least I feel like I'm preparing in a sense to enter some caves and some caverns together, holding our flaming torches and exploring this landscape of the mythopoetic, you know, the imaginal, weaving in and out of the importance of storytelling, wilderness connection, and all the rest of it. So just wanted to extend my thanks for joining me here on Birdsong, this creation of mine, and I appreciate you carving some time out of your day to sit down for this intentional convo.
Yeah, it's wonderful to be here, mate. Yeah.
Great. So one of the first things that I've been doing here on Birdsong is inviting guests to share something in light of the greater web that encompasses Birdsong, which is honoring the sacred. And as I'm sure you are well and truly familiar with, when we enter into sacred space, we typically share something of significance to honor the space that we are opening or entering. It might be a gesture of some sort, whether it's thought or a physical offering or words spoken, something to honor the sacred. And I would love to ask you about your relationship to this idea, or perhaps, as I have said before, it's more than just an idea. It's, for me anyway, it's a way of living, of breathing, of doing my best to cultivate a relationship with spirit, the mystery, the sacred in my daily life. So I guess what I'm doing is extending an invitation to you, and you're welcome to engage in any way that comes to you, whether it's describing your relationship to the sacred, ceremonial, or ritualistic living, or it could be sharing a prayer, a poem, a story, whatever you feel called to share to open up our little sacred communion together.
Yeah, thank you, brother. It's very real for me, actually. And as you were speaking, I realized that what I normally do is I light a couple of candles whenever I do a mentoring call, whenever I'm doing a group call or an interview. And I'm looking around going, oh, geez, where's my candles? The reason I do that is because one of the old ideas says the oldest man and the oldest woman that ever lived live inside the fire, and they have heard every story that ever was. And so there's kind of this instinctual thing that many of us have done before when we're young. We wrote something on a bit of paper. Yeah, we were lamenting, or maybe we were wishing for something. Yeah, but it was something private. But we also wanted it to be heard, just not by our parents or perhaps our friends. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
And we went outside and we burnt it, or we buried it in the ground, or we gave it to running water. And these are the three ways that you can offer up a prayer to the invisible world, or the more than human world, the wild other, whatever you want to call it, this great presence, which is difficult to speak about with words. We can just call it the mystery. The old poets, you'll see, they'll say God, they'll say the guest house, they'll say the beloved. They're talking about the same thing. And God is just the shortest. It's a 3-letter word. It's the shortest way to say that, to speak of that. So one of the practices I've been deepening in is this gesture of inviting all manner of invisible help. Whenever I'm on a call, whenever I'm on an interview, whatever it is, whenever I'm going into something that's very meaningful to me, perhaps even at the beginning of my day, even when I'm sitting to study, actually, I light these candles. And over time, I've seen this done by people who are older than me. And it really hit me when I was over in England and I was studying with Martin, who is very sincere and very simple in the way he brings in the sacred. He doesn't overlabor it. Yeah, there's not a lot of bells and whistles or smoke and all this kind of paraphernalia. It's just very sincere and very direct in the way he's speaking. And there's kindness and compassion in his words. And I got the sense there one day that as he was speaking, that all these poets, all these great artists like Rembrandt and Picasso, and Lorca and Rilke were all showing up, and we're standing behind him and we're speaking through him.
Amazing.
Yeah? And the gravitas, and then therefore what Victor, is it Victor Turnbull? I can't remember his name. Called communitas. This gravity of a community would start to exist. It was this amazing experience. And so I recognized that the way forward on this path, as we're entering the sacred, paradoxically, of course, is to go backwards, and is to recognize who's standing behind us and whose shoulders we're standing on and ostensibly speaking out into the world from. Yeah. So it's no small thing. It's like if you love a book and you love the way that author writes, then the question is, what were they reading? Like, who inspired them? And follow the breadcrumb trail all the way back. And what I found, if you follow it back far enough, where do you arrive? Mythology. Yeah. And the traditional cultures. You arrive, in people who studied African masks or Greek mythology and all these kinds of things, because that mythology is the source of culture that can carry the weight of the word anyway. Yeah. So any great work of art, and actually the purpose of art, is this alchemical merging point where the deep inner meets the great outer. And the art shows us that the laws that govern the two are not separate. They're the same. Yeah. And it sort of collapses that duality. And so therefore, these great works of art, through which culture is born from, of which myth is the source, culture becomes the golden thread that weaves the inner, the deep inner, and the great outer together, the two great natures of the world. So one of the ways I like to begin any kind of, acknowledgement of that we're entering sacred space, which, by the way, means we're entering into a place of power, in the churches, how they got the gargoyles at the top.
Oh, yeah.
And you're entering a church, a place that's sacred, and people go, why are the gargoyles up there? I thought we're entering a place of a sacred place. And they're saying, yeah, when you enter a place of that is sacred, you're entering a place of power. So be careful, because you're going to come up against your inner demons. Yeah? It's obvious why religion has become such a big power and monopoly in the world and has become perverted. Yeah. Because whenever the sacred is present, there is power present, the imagination is present, and therefore all manner of abundance is present. And one of the great poets said, that which has no shadow has no strength to live. So as we grow in our power, as we keep entering sacred space and grow in our power, our shadow also gets bigger. So we've got to be careful of those demons, man, those gargoyles, they're following us around, and they're keeping us honest. So here's a poem from the Inuits. It's perhaps more of a spoken word piece, and it's called Magic Words. So in the earliest time, when both humans and animals lived on Earth, a person could become an animal, and an animal could become a person. Sometimes they were people, sometimes they were human beings. There was no difference. All spoke the same language. This was a time when words were like magic. Something spoken by chance might have strange consequences. It could suddenly come alive. And what people wanted to happen could happen. All they had to do was say it. No one can explain this. It's just the way it was.
Leon, you've got me all fired up. I'm feeling all kinds of things inside me. There is just so much profundity in all of that. Mate, I'm not sure how long it is that we have been connected for, but I must say I feel and find so much depth in the words that you have to share, whether it's through written word or speech. What you share, which I take to be stories, poems, reflections, musings, they, for me, often cut to the core of things, as in they're received with my mind, or rather they come through my sensory apparatus of my eyes or my ears. But before I have an inclination or a chance to analyze them or reflect on them with my incessantly overactive monkey mind, at least at times that's the case anyway, they've seemingly bypassed or short-circuited these parts of myself. And these words, your words, they find resonance in a deeper place within me. Call it heart, call it soul. There's something about this way of speaking, of writing, of articulating that I behold. There's real treasure within. There's wealth. There's a form of currency, of richness there. So what is it that this thread that I'm picking up on it? It has something to do with the importance of imagination, the imaginal realm, the mythic imagination, soul language. You know, sometimes I find I have a bit of a hard time encapsulating or articulating with any real clarity what this is, and perhaps this is one of those moments. But can you speak to that? What are your thoughts on what it
Yeah.
is that I'm trying to say
Yeah.
here?
Let's do something which I love to do, is lean on some of the old ones. Yeah. This is why whenever I run anything, the content is the poetry and the stories. Yeah. I lean on all those that have come before us, and then the poetry and the stories will stir up something that's living within us. You know, myth is this wonderful way, because when someone is telling a story, the myth is not saying this is true, and you know it's not true. And the myth is not saying you have to believe it, or even trying to convince us in any way possible. But something in us recognizes that this seemingly untrue story is somehow speaking about primordial patterns and behaviors, not just of the human nature, but the, the bigger nature as well. And somehow it's speaking very directly to something very private about our lives in a reflected image. And so we're able to see ourselves in the miraculous, in the wider scope of things. So myth, what it does, and the beauty of myth, is it expands things. Yeah. Here's William Blake. The imagination is not a state, it is the human existence itself. And so when we tend to think, humans tend to think in stories, we tend to think in imagery. So therefore, the imagination, and here's Ted Hughes. Let me just read a little thing of his. Great 20th century poet, one of the greatest poets of his generation, without a doubt. The basic type of, he says here, the basic type of imagination, you know, if we just say someone has a big imagination or a small imagination, we're just saying that we tend to, when we think, we tend to imagine in images. So he's saying the basic type of imagination is our most valuable piece of practical equipment. It is the control panel for everything we do, so it ought to be education's first concern. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So we tend to think that humans made up these stories. But actually, we understand that it's talking about myth is the way nature speaks. Myth is the language through which the earth speaks. So one of the questions Martin would ask, Martin Shaw, who's a teacher of mine, would say, what if we were the conduits through which the earth is trying to speak through? Yeah. My sense of it, that's when the words become like magic, because something bigger is moving through us. And my sense of it is we've all had this experience to some degree, where we've been struck by awe. Yeah, where we've felt just immersed and enveloped by something miraculous that by its very nature is difficult to speak about. So, I mean, let me just change a little gear here. I shared this the other day, and it's a very, for me, a very powerful thing to share when we're talking about poetry and mythology and its essence in our very nature. One way to think of the difference between the two is if you have a mythic experience. So if you're out walking in the woods, or you're walking along the great threshold where the ocean meets the sand, and the way the light just seems to strike you, and a silver heron flies past, and for all of a sudden, there's a sudden psychic shift. That's how you know when the mythic is present. You were churning and ruminating about something that happened through the day, and all of a sudden you were just lassoed for revelation. A sudden psychic shift, all in one moment. One of the natural compulsions therefore, is to write a poem about that. And so poetry weds us to the mythic. And so when you read a poem, it's not the mythic itself, yeah? It's not the actual experience itself, but we might get a kind of scent of that sauntering fragrance off the old sea, you know, and we might just all of a sudden, it might act as a bridge or as a conduit, as a path which takes us into the mythic experience, which is to say, it opens up the imaginal realm, the imagination, where, as I said before, abundance is present. Everything is in there. Now, people say, what do you want? Like, I want everything. Well, do you know where you find everything? In the imaginal realm. That's where it is. And you get it all. Be careful. If you ask for everything, it means everything, you know, all the seemingly, the good and the bad. But here's Charles Darwin, man. And this is in Charles Darwin's autobiography. So these are his words. He's in his older age. And he is lamenting because he's given himself so much to facts and analytical data and methodical ways of thinking and collating and measuring and that kind of linear malaise of the human mind. He's lamenting that this other part of his brain, which I suppose we call the right-hand side of the brain, has atrophied to a certain degree that he can't even enjoy poetry or music anymore. So let me just read his words. Poetry of many kinds gave me great pleasure, and even as a schoolboy, I took intense delight in Shakespeare, especially in the historical plays. I have also said that formerly pictures gave me considerable and music very great delight. But now, for many years, I cannot endure to read a line of poetry. I have tried lately to read Shakespeare and found it so intolerably dull that it nauseated me. I have also lost almost any taste for pictures or music. My mind seems to have become a kind of machine for grinding general laws out of large collections of fact, but why this should have caused the atrophy of that part of the brain alone on which the higher taste depends, he's calling it the higher taste depend, I cannot conceive. The loss of these tastes is a loss of happiness and may possibly be injurious to the intellect and more probably to the moral character by enfeebling the emotional part of our nature.
Yeah.
This is Charles Darwin, mate. You know, I mean, whether you believe in evolutionary biology or not, it's in the water. It's just in the water.
Yeah, look, it points to, it illuminates for me the knowing, perhaps the fact that our culture has become so obsessed with analysis and literalism that this barren desert threatens to sweep away our creativity and our imagination to the sands of time. You know, it's creating meaning out of facts and data and theories and becoming boxed into this linear way of thinking has removed this very important essence that you're speaking to, our ability to tap into the imaginal, to tap into the mythic, and to have all of nature, all of mystery speak through us in this way, so we can access these deeper elements of self and life. That's what it's reflecting back for me.
Yeah, beautifully said, brother. And it's not that facts are bad, but it's just that facts can never speak to the whole truth. So when we begin to treat facts as truth, then we have what we have, therefore, is the collapse of the imagination. And we begin to take things literally, and we lose the symbolic side, the metaphorical sense in the world that is actually the sense that makes nature revelatory. If I just take everything literally, it's just a tree, it's just a river, it's just an ocean. But if I begin to behold it with a certain type of attention, and I'm saying behold it, yeah? This certain type of attention, and it's proportionate to the sincerity and depth of my attention is proportionate to the revelatory nature of whatever it is. And again, we go back to this idea that we are governed by the same laws, yeah, the inner nature and the great nature. So when we put our attention on something and it becomes revelatory, we begin to see that golden web, that golden thread, yeah, which Stafford talked about. The golden thread you follow. Yeah, he says you never let go of that thread. Yeah. And he says in that poem, people ask about the thread and it's difficult to talk about it because it's mysterious by nature. Yeah. It goes amongst things.
Yeah, it's so interesting. What's coming to me now is that whatever it is that we're talking about, whether it's stories, myth, poetry, I feel as though they are paradoxically aging me in one sense, while also getting me more in touch with aspects of my youth. I don't know if that makes any sense to you. Maybe the aging that I'm speaking to is really a connection to this infinite aspect of self, soul, which feels so deep. It's not bound by time, which is why it feels so ancient, yet at the same time brings up this, allows me to feel into this essence within self, this awe and this wonder. And the question that's actually coming through right now is, and in some regard I have an inkling of the answer, but I'm interested in what kind of impact storytelling and myth and poetry has had on you, and as in the progression, the evolution. What has that looked like for you in the way that you show up on a daily basis, from the moment that you wake up to the coaxing of magpie call followed by the kookaburras to the chorus of insects that sing out as your head hits the pillow, to the Dreamtime realms. And perhaps this is pressing on a bit of your timeline as well, from when you were younger up until where you are today. And if you feel called, it might be nice to introduce some of the key pillars, the momentous occasions, if you will, along your journey of becoming so deeply immersed in this world, and then the impact it's all had on you throughout your daily living.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'd love to go back in time. And there's this gesture in one's life, and it's called being loyal to your village bells. And so it's, as you're asking, being loyal to the bells of your village. So going back into your childhood and asking what was the unique imagery or the music or the movies or the experiences that one had that really got us in many ways in the shape we are today. And in our child's mind, we were in awe, we were enraptured by those moments, just kind of naturally, instinctually. But also there was another part of ourselves which was seeing and relating to a deeper primordial pattern in that imagery, in that experience, which our younger mind just couldn't address because we were just in the full experience of it. So one of the things as adults is to rekindle, and rehydrate these experiences we've had, because in that we get in touch with a more subtle, finer, wiser, more infinite part of ourselves. And it was Carl Jung who said the most important question to ask is whether you believe a part of you is married to the infinite or not. That's going to create two very separate trajectories. For me, when I was younger, I got a sense of this from a very, very early on, that I could be entered by something. That's what it felt like. I remember lying in my bed on those still, cool autumn nights. And, I grew up in big sky country where it's a big farming area. And I could hear a tractor moaning far off over yonder in a paddock, miles away. But it was just traveling, one of those still nights where sound just travels. And I don't know how this happened. but as that tractor with the scarifier on the back sort of tore up the hairy back of the earth, I would kind of like squint my ears or something, and it would sound to me as if the earth itself was moaning. And for me, that was the first time that a deep sadness and almost grief entered me. And I would lie there paralyzed in my bed, and I'd watch shadows of gum leaves dance, on my wall with the moonlight. And it was the most worldly thing I'd ever experienced. And I could never talk about it. And eventually I would be kind of let go from that grasp. Perhaps it was when the farmer ran out of fruitcake and coffee and was cold to the bone. He needed to go home, and he turned off that diesel guzzling beast, and I just passed out. But in the morning, I could never work out whether I dreamt it or whether it actually happened. But it actually doesn't matter, does it? Since I can remember, one of the things I loved the most was going on long walks through the countryside with my dog. Yeah. And it was having a dog that taught me this language that can happen between animals and humans. Any one of us who have had a pet will know this. I mean, like yourself with a 2-year-old little girl, like before she could talk, just in that first year, you would have had to get so refined into her gestures and her certain tonalities of her cries to know what she needed. So Absolutely. There's a language that exists beyond words, right? We know this. And I would have this sense as he was walking off in front of me that my senses were connected to his, that I could see through his eyes. Yeah, by watching him and watching his gestures and the way he paused and the directions he looked, I was getting information back from where my personal senses were limited. So I was sensing through his senses. And this is an animistic thing, When you go and spend time in Indigenous cultures, I went up to Arnhem Land last year, and for them, it's not a concept that the tree is part of them or the mountain is part of them. It's like, it's not a reflection. So I don't have to reflect on that like we do. It's a lived, embodied experience. And so I kept having moments of this. And then at some point in my youth, an old farmer over the acres found in the hollow of a gum tree a little Aboriginal baby wrapped up in possum skin. It was a burial site. And suddenly, this whole world opened up to me. Because I wasn't taught about Aboriginal people at school. And suddenly, this country that I had been playing in and running wild had a whole different weight to it. I'm like, wait. So, and then Dad told me, oh, there's an earth oven down at the bus stop where they would have roasted kangaroos. Yeah. And there's a stone where they would have sharpened their tools. And I began to wonder, where have these people gone? And I would dream of this little possum girl. I remember having this reoccurring dream of me standing, looking at the tree, and all her family were around the tree and they were all grieving and lamenting. And I'm leaning in to hear the name that her mother is crooning over this small, lifeless body. And as I'm leaning in, she's saying, Aboriginal, Aboriginal, Aboriginal. And I would always wait. And this word, Aboriginal, Aboriginal, would be going through my mind. And I'd ask myself, if we're not from here, where are we Aboriginal to? How did we get here? And without knowing it, I was starting to prod the dark underbelly of colonial Australia, And so I wasn't getting much feedback, mate, There's a lot of ignorance, and a lot of naivety, and a lot of, I don't want to turn to face that. Yeah. And so it's not explicit, but it's implicit that those kinds of inquiries aren't welcome around here. And so therefore that infinite part of ourselves at some point, not just one moment, And for me, it wasn't just that one moment, but it starts to get shut down because there's nowhere to be in a living conversation with it. Yeah, doesn't feel right within the community, and we're so wired and geared for attachment and to belong.
Yeah, sure. Our society and culture just doesn't seem set up to be able to hold that.
No. And so the implicit or the subtext of that is we don't talk about that around here. You know, I had an experience once when I was standing up on the dam bank and the wind was just rummaging through the plains, yeah, just guzzling through. And it's, you know, you've probably stood in those winds before. You can really lean into it. You can feel the weight of it, you know. And I was just struck with glee, man. You know, this wind felt like this great storyteller that had come from way, way, far, far away, and was bringing all this gossip and all these different fragrances as well, and texture to the air. And it was stirring, and I could see the way it was bending the trees over as if they were having a very lively, sort of vivacious conversation, you know. And I got struck in that moment, and it was very confronting at the time because it was very simple. It was a voice that said, "You're not from here. You're from over the seas." And that was it. That was it. And I was like, what? Who was that? Who said that? You know? And I remember going, like, you know, I would have just looked all roughed up and loved by the wind, you know, that my hair would have been everywhere. I just would have just looked ecstatic. I've just had a, what would you call that? It's like a, it's
hard for me to put into words. It's a communion with the wild.
The communion with the wild, right? Let's just put it that way. I go into the house and there's my mum sitting down knitting in front of the fire. My brother, I don't know, he's probably building little card houses or something in the old farmhouse. And I'm just like shaking with glee, you know? I'm trembling with excitement. And I'm like, the wind is so strong out there. And my mum turns to me, she goes, I know, I hate the wind. And then my brother says, yeah, I hate the wind too. Like, and I stopped myself, and I knew that it wasn't a safe place to have this conversation, that it wouldn't be heard.
Mm-hmm.
So just to illustrate that, I think for all of us in our childhood, we had moments where we were having what we just called, say, a communion with the wild. It's a nice way of putting it. And we also had running parallel to that experiences where it wasn't implicitly or explicitly welcome, or the space just couldn't hold that conversation. Like maybe you spoke about it and someone said, oh, that's really nice, good for you. That hurts, man.
Oh yeah. Hurts. Oh yeah, we see this thread show up in so many different forms and manifestations of many aspects of our life. Yeah.
So, you know, what's one of the ideas that becoming adult means rekindling your relationship with your inner child. Yeah, and this what you were speaking about before. I mean, that's finding the fountain of youth, is that relationship with our inner child. You know, the grail, the quest. It's never for something outside of ourselves, but we often have to walk far. It seems that the human pilgrimage requires us to walk far away from our essential nature. Because when we were born, our essential nature is not a conscious thing. We're just in it. It's because we're immersed in the mythic. So children are more likely to have these experiences that I'm talking about. Through a litany of events which tell us that those conversations aren't really allowed or can't be had, and then obviously the education that we go into down the linear train of thought, we begin to walk away from that which was naturally bequeathed to us, that which is our aboriginal, our inner aboriginal, the way our inner aboriginal would think and imagine and speak in the world. Yeah. But we have to walk far away from it to one day wake up and feel the pain, the excruciating pain and the trauma of recognizing that we're lost and that we lost contact with something, the only thing we know that can walk us home. And so then that's the turning. That's the turning to face the beast in the mythic. Yeah. That's also, as we spoke about earlier, the turning to face all the ones who stand behind us and following their threads too, following that breadcrumb trail all the way home. And now you know that every betrayal you made, you know, every heartbreak that you had was necessary. And as you turn to walk home, those betrayals become like lighthouses, you know, that show you where not to go anymore. Don't go to the rocks. Don't get shipwrecked again over there, you know. And so they become the guiding lights that show us the path in the middle. And myth is the thing in the middle, and the human is the thing in the middle, and we're here to hold both. And poetry and mythology, for me, reignited that what was a conversation I was having when I was a child, but it's also a conversation that some Aboriginal part of myself has been having since the dawn of time, and I have no doubt about that.
Oh man, there's just so many potent threads that you've woven into that dialogue. Yeah, look, and what's coming to mind for me is how we are, or rather how we can perhaps weave this, I think it's already woven in there, this moving forward into wilderness immersion and connecting with nature. These threads seem to be inextricably intertwined with the storytelling and the poetry that we're talking about. And this weaves me into some of your path of becoming a wilderness rite of passage guide. And, you know, we're talking about the wilderness vigil, the vision quest. And this is one of the pathways that we can take to help us, in many regards. And, you know, I must admit, I have a deep longing in my heart to quest. I haven't formally gone on a multiple day vision quest yet. The stars just haven't quite aligned, but I know that this event is on the precipice of eventuating, and obviously part of my own process of initiation. Into what specifically, I can't say, but I suspect very strongly it's all surrounding my connection to nature, to spirit, to these sorrows that you're speaking to that reside deep within my heart, you know, the expression that wants to bubble up more vigorously from the depths of my soul. And, you know, when it comes to rites of passage and crying for a vision, I love this old idea. And it's this old idea that, you know, women naturally are connected to the creative powers of spirit and mystery through the very internal process of becoming pregnant, growing life, giving birth, whereas men don't have that innate ability. So it's said that men have somewhat more of an affinity to find and express their creativity elsewhere. And that's not to say that women cannot do the same thing, of course, but speaks to the idea that, you know, men are more driven to seek out this sense of purpose in the external world. And one of the ways that we do that, as we both know, it's through the vision quest. It's reaching a stage in our life where we feel the tug, the pull of something much larger than ourselves wanting to come through, and we don't know what it is. And so we cry for a vision. We call to the mystery to give us a sign, a message to show us our purpose, our place in the greater web of life. And it seems like something is permeating into the greater depths of the soul, where we seek guidance, or this deeper connection to spirit, to the land, to there's an importance to all of this. And what I'm getting at is that the strength of our vision seems to be deeply intertwined with our connection to spirit. And if the vision is sincere and it's pure, it's not only going to serve our heart and soul, but it's going to serve our people, our community. And, you know, the old ones say that a man without vision can't be trusted because he's only half a man. So perhaps within there is an invitation to speak a little bit about the nature immersion that comes with wilderness vigil within this rite of passage that is the vision quest, and how this interweaves with the some of the dialogue that you were touching on earlier.
Yeah. Well, you covered a lot of ground there. There's many threads to pick up. Well, let's just start here. So one of the easiest ways to understand rites of passage or initiations is to see it in the mythic sense, that it's not something that humans go through. It's a natural law, it's a pattern, a primordial image that nature is going through. So every year, the world is going through this great cycle. Yeah. So in nature, linear time doesn't exist. It's cyclical. Yeah. And so one of the ways, one of the things that people forget is that humans are the human way of being nature. Because then I don't understand why there would be this whole vernacular that it would all be better if we weren't here, as if we were some kind of alien or foreigner to this place. But we're the human way of doing nature, and at our highest calling, we actually enhance nature. You can walk through the woods and you can be speaking a poem out, yeah, sparking the world properly wild with your words, with a trembling vivacity, and you can see how it actually impacts the world around you. Yeah, just like that poem said, this was a time when words were like magic. Something said by chance might have strange consequences. Yeah, it could suddenly come alive. We've forgotten this. We've forgotten this. So we are the way through which nature wants to speak through us. So one of the things I say to people who are in that lament, where they're looking for this triangulation of their purpose, their passion, and their vision, yeah, and the magnetic center of that, one of the key things a vision quest asks you, or the gesture and the essence of it, is to just go without for a while. You know, grant yourself the gift of going without and see what wants to come through. Because here's the thing, is that it wants to come through you. Something wants to come through us by nature. That's just the way it is. But if we, you know, sort of pervade and fog our lives with all manner of paraphernalia, it can't enter. And then we think the way is to start seeking and grasping, you know, and feel like we're running out of time, when actually what we need to do is slow down, slow right down, and cut away all the detritus of our life. This is what a vision quest does. It came from traditional, you know, and here's the thing. I was going to say it comes from traditional people or ancient people, you know, but when they were living, they were modern humans, just like we're modern humans now. Do you know what I mean? They were on the same frontier. But they were looking out and saying, okay, so, all right, so the birds do that every year, and the tree drops its leaves every year, and then it's getting bigger. Yeah, and it looks like what it's dropping is nourishing the soil beneath it, and it's actually creating the nutrients for it to grow. And we've got to understand too that mimicry, just like imagination, is one of the two superpowers of humans. Yeah, in the mass that a lot of the African cultures made, it's mimicking, yeah, the natural world. A lot of the dances, a lot of the songs, it's through mimicry that we're learning. When you're a little girl, she would be right into mimicry right now. And we know that children learn by what we do, not what we say. So we know we're hardwired for mimicry. So if we're paying attention to nature, we will realize, and we see ourselves in great nature, we'll realize that we too need to go through some kind of constant cyclical birth, death and rebirth constantly. The vision quest isn't something that you do once. And a vision quest isn't something that just exists out there on the margins of life, out in the wild primordial wood. It exists right at the center of your life too. And there's one of the kind of conundrums people get themselves sort of knotted up in these days is the addiction to edge experiences. Yeah. Myth is saying both. You need to leave the castle. You need to leave the center, and you need to walk all the way to the edge of your understanding, wherever that is. You know, that's often depicted by the woman, the wise old woman at the edge of the world, you know, the wise old man at the edge of the world, whatever, you know what I mean? And there's some kind of revelation happens. In the archetype of initiation, you have separation, ordeal, and return. The point of the separation, the point of leaving the center of the castle and walking all the way to the far edge of our understanding, is to go through some manner of ordeal. Yeah, the vision quest that's a fucking ordeal, man. You know, that's a slow burn. There's no glory in it, that's for sure. But the purpose of the ordeal is the revelation of oneself to oneself. That's the purpose of the ordeal. The separation is to lead us into the ordeal. The purpose of the return is to carry it back. To carry it back. That's what relationship means. If you follow the linguistic origins of the world, it means to carry it home. So when you're in a relationship with your partner, you go out and you work there, she works there, and you come home and you carry back the day. How was your day? Oh, this happened, da 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 da. And you're in relationship. Yeah. And the human is a vessel. Yeah, we're pilgrims walking from here to there. And we're supposed to walk way beyond and far away, you know, from the center of ourselves. That is half of the human pilgrimage, as I said earlier, to learn through all the pain and learn through losing ourselves what we lost. Because we're here to become conscious of who we are, whereas children aren't conscious of who they are. They're just who they are, just like nature is just who it is instinctually. But it seems that humans have this capacity to kind of nullify or inhibit or stunt our growth and our own essential nature, which was bequeathed to us. But we're supposed to feel the pain, because it's then waking up to the pain. We walk home back to the center of the castle. We carry back the revelation. And the gift and the vision that we received up on the mountain actually only comes into full form at the center of the castle. Yeah, when we give it, because the gift is not strictly for us. It's for the anima mundi, the soul of the world. And so if we don't give it, it's not a neutral thing, man. We're actually taking. We're living on the take. It's a negative thing. So you can see that the simplicity and the sincerity in Vision Quest of just going without to see if something other than your whirring cogs wants to come through and support you and carrying you home. But you got to fucking hear the trumpets blaring, man. Most people don't hear the trumpets blaring, or they don't want to hear them. I don't want to go home. It's a perilous journey, the return. It's the most difficult. And whether you're doing plant medicines, or whether you're doing vision questing, or whether you're doing any form of spiritual training, for me, the message is always saying, it's saying you're the medicine, and it's time to really show up to the center of your life. Yes, go and have the edge experiences, have the revelation, but that's half the piece. And so one way to understand people, for example, who get caught in those edge experiences, however they're characterized, is separation, ordeal, separation, ordeal. And that's the cycle of addiction, man. Whether that's alcohol, that's your ordeal. Yeah. Whether it's whatever drug it is, whether it's sex, you know, because the separation is the sense that I'm separate from, you know, the laws that govern both the great nature and the inner nature. So this vision quest is an ancient rite of passage. It's as old as dirt. And when I run them with Jero, we use poetry and myth at the centerpiece of them, because what we're saying through that is that stories are as old as biology. Yeah, we're not just made up by our genetics and certain patterns, but we're made up of these stories that have been traveling thousands and thousands since dawn dot, man. Thousands and thousands of years in the hearts and the minds of all those that stand behind us.
Look, so many pertinent pieces to acknowledge there and reflect on. You know, in particular, what's coming to me right now is sacred reciprocity, as you speak to.
Yeah.
It's very, very important to hold that dear to our heart, nice and close to our chest. Not just take, but asking ourselves the question, what can we give in return? And it seems like part of the bones of Vision Quest is giving up these things, giving up all of our worldly comforts.
Yeah. We'll put it this way, because we started talking about the sacred. So how do you make something sacred? My sense of it is it begins with a sacrifice. If this conversation is going to be sacred, you and I better fucking leave our egos at the front door for this hour or an hour and a half. Do you know what I mean? Let's just sacrifice our egos and see what wants to come through that's other than, you know, our own whirring cogs. Use that phrase again. So at the core of the vision quest, this going without, there is a sacrifice. So actually what we recognize that to become human, and the old cultures knew that a human being wasn't born, a human being was made, and it was made through the successive rites of passages and initiatory experiences throughout the course of one's life. We kind of just look at the boy becoming the young man or the girl becoming the young woman, but there's many, many initiations that happen throughout our life. The old idea is every moment an initiation, but of course, because at the center of an initiation is a threshold where you can't go back. So every moment is an initiation because you can't go back. So without sacrifice and all the old myths and stories, what they're teaching us through the imagery is how to learn the art of appropriate sacrifice. They're saying, what are you willing to give up? As Martin would say, what characterizes culture, what makes culture at times of trouble and inevitably so deep water that we all enter either individually or as a collective. And we could say that we're in that now as far as climate change is concerned and COVID. It's not made or characterized by what we're willing to gain. It's made by what we're willing to walk away from. And one of the big messages coming through now is, what are we willing to sacrifice? And not just for our lives, but for the generations to come. Who will they look back? You know, who are they going to look back on? Are we going to be ancestors that are worthy of that? Were we the ones that were willing to walk away from some of the luxuries and the comforts? Because it's one of the things we've confused is comfort for luxury. Yeah. Were we willing to walk away from it? Were we willing to go without? So the quest, again, is happening right at the fucking center of our lives. It's not just a 4-day, 4-night experience where we go without food up there. We're asking to quest right here at the center, because the other essence and other way to understand questing is how to ask the most beautiful, the most real questions of your life. You're not looking for answers anymore. You're being guided by questions. That's questing. And you know when you ask a good question, because the nature of the question, just like that one, when you understand that culture is made by what we're willing to walk away from or let go of, the asking of that question brings us to a different ground. Just the asking of the question itself will bring us to standing on new ground. And we'll be as impactful on our sense of who we are as any answer would be anyway. And we begin living the quest.
Yeah, man, it's so interesting that you touch on this link, this chain between sacrifice and also the sacred. And I don't know if it seems like there's some sort of a core or some similar place, a linked etymology there within sacrifice and sacrament.
Yeah.
I don't know. But, it's interesting for me to reflect on you speaking about these questions that we ask ourselves. It's for about the past 5 or 6 weeks, I've been getting up almost every single morning before the daybreak star passes over eastern horizon. And I say almost every morning because yesterday morning was the first morning that I didn't do this, but I've been making my way out past the creek down by the side of my house, and there's a beautiful little park there, and have a little sit spot. And it's a time for me to make offerings, whether it's physical offerings or whether it's sharing a poem or a song or reading a story. And it's throughout this time that I have been asking myself this new question that I hadn't been asking myself before. And this question that has been coming to me is there's a couple of different questions there. And some of these are, how can I best honor the life that I live? How can I honor the sacred? And another question that's been coming to me is, what is it that I'm carrying? What is it that I'm carrying forth? And this touches on what you were talking about before, getting in touch with, these experiences, and I've experienced this as well many, many times over, working with plant medicines and shamanism and other kind of transformational experiences, if we want to call them that. These messages that come through is that we are the medicine, and it's up to us to embody and bring forth the messages.
Had a technical problem there, mate. My computer nearly out the window.
All good. Yeah, for those listening in, they might have heard a bit of a clunk, but they're all good. Yeah, the carrying these particular questions, like you're speaking to, and these are some of the things that I'm sitting with when it comes to what is it that I'm carrying with me. I want to be carrying my medicine. I want to be carrying this sense of the sacred. I want to be carrying these important questions so I can move forward in a soulful way. And when you're talking about the quest, and intertwined with that, of course, is everything that we've been talking about. It's connection to spirit, to mystery, to nature. And I've been reading, I'm sure you're familiar with David Abram.
Yeah.
Did you? I think, yeah. So recently I've been reading his book, Becoming Animal. Mm-hmm. And I love this idea that he puts forth, okay, yeah, I'm going to go there. So if we are to, exclaim that all aspects of nature, the birch tree, the oak tree, the lizard sunbathing on the rock itself, they each have their own voice. And if we are to still the mind, and if we are to give up these aspects of life, to be able to come to sit in the silence and come to learn from spirit, from mystery, from nature, then we can tap into this animistic intelligence that you've spoken to and enter this worldly, nature-based dialogue, this conversation, this way of communicating and listening to the language that's spoken by all of these seemingly separate individuals that are all around us all the time. And a skeptic might say that that's not the tree talking to you, that's just the wind rustling through the needles or the foliage or the sound that you're picking up on. Say that again, Leon.
Just the wind.
Just the wind. Yeah. Just the wind. Yeah. It's nothing but the breeze animating what would, be otherwise seemingly a inert life form, in some sense. And all we're doing is anthropomorphizing it, giving it a human quality, seeing it through the lens of the maybe just the logical, rational part of the humanness that we are. But I like this idea that when we take a moment to reflect on our own voice, is it not also air, a form of breeze, internal wind moving through us, giving rise to sound and animating what's inside us? And, you know, of course, we could link that into the neurons and the neurotransmitters and the chemicals, which, of course, you know, that's certainly one way of articulating what it is that's happening, you know, all these complexities that occur with thinking and speaking. But, you know, I'm not sure it's possible to really exclude this possibility or notion that the tree, the rock, the wind, they all have their own language in
Most definitely.
which they're communicating. And you know, I guess what I'm pointing to is that yes, all of nature is alive, and as David Abram puts it, language or meaningful speech is, you know, it's not an exclusively human possession, but it is part of a web of this intelligent, breathing cosmos that we're all a part of. And you know, everything's animated, everything has its own essence, and it's communicating with us in a myriad of tongues, which I guess finally is leading me to my destination. And this is something that you briefly touched on, which is to say that the stories, the vocalizations, the verbalizations are in themselves alive, and it's part of the animistic worldview. Sounds are alive, vocalizations, the thought processes, they all have their own life form, you know, their own wings that take flight, their own tendrils that squeeze and squirm, their own breath that makes the window foggy. They're a living organism. Yeah, my reflections are after hearing you speak.
I'm just going to close this door a little bit because it's banging around.
Yeah, please do.
Yes. I wanted to just go back a little bit to these questions you were asking. Because often we ask the questions in a format that keeps us safe. Because then you must ask, who's asking the question? Yeah. Because a real question is terrifying by its nature, or quite revelatory by its nature. So we can ask 100 questions and none of them really strike the center. But a good question, whether you're asking it of yourself or someone's asking it of you, is akin to drawing back a bow and firing an arrow right into the center, right into your Aboriginal essence. Yeah, right into the Aboriginal essence of the place where you are governed by the same laws as the great nature outside of you. So what's often the response when you ask a good question of yourself or someone else? Silence. Well, that makes sense, you know. And so you were asking, what am I here to carry? Well, why not flip the question and ask, what's been carrying me?
I love that.
Yeah. And here's Rilke, Rainer Maria Rilke. This poem is called Just as the Winged Energy of Delight. Yeah, that's what he calls this thing that's been carrying us when we're younger, the winged energy of delight. And at some point, we have to carry that and we have to work with that. Yeah. If we're going to truly say that we lived and loved and that we raised ourselves up to the highest calling of a human being, which is to make beauty in the world, which is to make art, yeah, is to walk this path of artistry as pilgrims. And he says, just as the winged energy of delight carried you over the many chasms early on, now raise up the daringly imagined bridges holding the astounding, he says, now raise the daringly imagined arches holding up the astounding bridges. He says this, miracle doesn't only exist in the amazing living through and defeat of danger. Miracles become miracles in the clear achievement that is earned. Miracles become miracles in the clear achievement that is earned. To work with things is not hubris. when building the association beyond words. Denser and denser the pattern becomes, being carried along is not enough. Now stretch your well-disciplined strengths between two opposing poles, because inside human beings is where God learns. So he's asking us to ask what has been carrying us. And he's also saying, now recognize that a miracle is in the clear achievement that is earned by working with things. He says to work with things is not hubris. It's not arrogant to work with things. You know, this kind of spiritual holier than thou, trying to get away from the material part of the world. Actually, this is what pleases the gods the most in mythology, is when humans make things with their hands, when we make beautiful things. Yeah. And so Rilke was actually saying inversely that not to work with things is hubris. That's spiritual arrogance. Why else would we be given these amazing hands, man? And he's saying, when building the association beyond words. So one of the biggest challenges humans have is the move, this shift from the throat to the hands. Yeah, that's an alchemical move, brother. Yeah, that's where the idea gets formed in the imaginal, invisible realm. Yeah, and then we start speaking the idea. But then we have to make that big alchemical shift to the hands and actually bring it into form. That's bringing something from the invisible realm into the visible realm, into the tangible, textual, sensual realm that David Abram talks about, you know, in Spell of the Sensuous. That's what we're here to do, man. And in Celtic mythology, when the gods sit around the fire and they're waiting for the storyteller to lean in and spark those flames properly wild, they're waiting to hear stories of humans. Because we have something they don't have. Do you know what it is? Mortality, brother. We're mortals, and that makes all the difference. So when they look at us, they ask this: what did they do? What did they do with their lives knowing that they weren't going to live forever? Because they can't relate with that. What did we do knowing that we couldn't survive forever? And part of the turning, as I spoke about earlier in the conversation, to face the ones who stand behind us is to recognize, as Stephen Jenkinson would say, that death is the life-giving thing. When you hold the soil in your hand and you look at it, if you look at it as a scientist, you'll say, oh, so it's microbes and it's organic matter and that sort of thing. But a poet would say, that's everything that couldn't live forever. That's everything that couldn't survive forever in the form it once was. And we live off that, man. That's what we grow our food in. And so death is the life-giving thing.
Just cut straight to the core of things.
One of the big messages right now, and if we don't face it, is we're humans at some point, there is a birth of consciousness that happens in a human being when we begin to create a loving relationship with our own disappearance. Without that, it's hubris. The whole thing's hubris. I mean, you can't say that for children because they're not supposed to know that. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But once we're adults, we're supposed to have a relationship with that. And I'm not saying accept our death. I'm saying love. And so there's a beautiful question. What would it actually mean to love my death? What would it actually mean to lovingly participate in my own disappearance? Yeah. And you could look at that from what am I willing to sacrifice about myself for the better? That's participating in your own disappearance right now while you're living. What am I willing to sacrifice knowing that at the end, I get sacrificed anyway? I leave my body. My body gets sacrificed. So we understand that life is sacrifice. So we begin to learn the art of appropriate sacrifice. And all the old stories and the myths and the gods, they're asking one thing of us when we hear the story. They're asking us to obviously hear it and listen to it and allow it to move through us. But then they're saying, what are you going to do with it? What are you going to do with that wisdom? Because we get too caught up in psychology. This is my sense of it, and the kind of analytical mind. And I think psychology is a beautiful thing, but mythology is psychology in the language of imagination. Where do you think psychology was born from? The Greeks didn't have psychology, mate. They had mythology. They didn't even have mythology. They just had the stories. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I've heard you speak to this before. I think you've spoken to this before, that mythology and story, they are the way for us to use the imaginal realm, to use the myths to come full circle and bump into ourselves in a different way that we wouldn't have bumped into otherwise. We're illuminating these aspects of self that have always been there, but we haven't quite known they were there, or we haven't known them to the depths that we could.
Yeah. Yeah.
Look, you touched on something interesting as well. I don't know if you have something more to speak to about that, but speaking to David Abram, there was a question that I wanted to pose to you.
Yeah, go for it.
I just listened to a podcast, the Emergence Magazine podcast, just yesterday, and the fella on there was having a conversation or an interview with Robin Wall Kimmerer, the author of Braiding Sweetgrass. And David Abram posed this question to Robin through a chat board, and what he was saying, and this, I'm asking this question because you were speaking before about the alchemical magic of making something manifest from voice, from throat to hands to fingers to these beautiful appendages that we have. And the question that David was asking or posing was that, well, the back context is that oral traditions have been passed down, perhaps have had more of a proclivity to deepen our connection and understanding on an experiential level with the natural world around us. And with the advent and the evolution of written word, there can surely be the benefits of expanding on ideas, but it also includes the possibility to make abstractions and philosophize, which can kind of lead us away from our sensory disposition. And it's, it's this notion of face-to-face exchange that storytelling provides, and the face-to-place understanding, which are some of the pillars that help us connect more deeply to the natural world. And it's possible, it's arguable that written word can steer us away from the more than human exchange and narrows us into an exclusively human understanding.
Yeah.
Well, an exclusively human understanding and exchange, so much so that we're now in the domain where mountains and trees and rivers and lakes and the fish and the insects, they can no longer understand us in the way that they could when it was just the oral traditions being passed through. And if that is the case, and even if it isn't, still, how can we orient our writing and our storytelling through writing, our poetry through writing, to be more in service to replenishing oral culture?
Beautiful question. Beautiful question. I think we spoke about earlier in this when that poetry is what weds us to the mythic. So we recognize that poetry is not the thing, as beautiful as poetry is. So again, once we begin mistaking poetry for the thing itself, then we're steering ourselves away from, the furry emanations, that are wanting to speak to us. And we don't catch a whiff of that fragrance coming off the old sea anymore. So it's a really deep question, bro. And so what, I think his name was it was either Stanley Kunitz or Donald Hall, old poets, famous for saying that the words, a poem, if not spoken out loud, the words go cold on the page. So let me just answer this in the process of poetry, or attempt to, is there's a few ways to relate with poetry. One is you can read it in your head, but something's missing. And so one of the first steps to deepening a relationship with poetry is to read it out loud. Now you get to chew on the words, as you're speaking them out into the world, and you get a greater sense of what is the rhythm, what is the cadence, where am I stressing a certain point, and where are the pauses. And you might read it 2 or 3 times out. Another way to deepen it is, if you really like a poem, is to write it out. Now here's the movement from the voice to the hands, isn't it? Yeah. And you might write it in beautiful writing. Now you realize that's not the thing, but that thing's touched you, it connected you to something else. So you're honoring it now by writing on a page. You might put it up on your wall, and that poem travels with you over a period of time. You might then learn how to recite it, learn how to embody it, so that you can be walking through the woods and speak that poem out. And now, as you're speaking it out, it's not just coming verbatim. It's being tempered and influenced by all manner of things around you. The wind in the canopy, the bird song that's surrounding you, the crunching of the leaves underfoot, or the rhythm or the pace that you're walking. Or maybe you feel so inspired to do a twist or put your hands out or stop and yell one of the bits right up into the sky. And the poem suddenly becomes alive. And we can never measure or never know the impact that can have on the wild other, the more than human world, as Abram puts it. We can never know, but what we can know is that it is having an impact for sure. And when we're telling stories, as a storyteller, you are the conduit for the myth. You are the conduit for this big heavyweight story that's been traveling for thousands of years, thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And it's wanting to speak through you, but the story has its own imagination too. It's its own being. That's the way the storyteller relates to a story. Yeah. You have to court the story over a period of time. Yeah. As if you would court someone you deeply loved, as if you wanted to get to know who they are. And what's the most beautiful and humble way to get to know someone? You ask them questions. You ask them beautiful questions about them. We love that. We love when we get asked beautiful questions. So does a story. So does nature, man. Why wouldn't it? For far too long, we've been telling nature what it is. What if we just asked and recognized that it too has a sovereignty of its own, and it too has a way it wants to speak through us? So when the storyteller is telling the story, he is being influenced by the imagination and the sheer ancestry of the story, but also by the imagination of the listeners. And the triangulation of those three creates the magnetic center where the story actually becomes a living being and can actually strike right into the center. Otherwise, the storyteller's just saying something that they remembered. So the oral tradition is this beautiful, miraculous, honorable way to speak out into the world these old images, these old patterns that govern inner nature and great nature. And while we're listening to it, we begin to find that thread which weaves our very lives between the two.
You've left me a little bit speechless there, mate. It seems like such a beautiful way of answering the question that was posed. And I think perhaps this could be a beautiful way for us to start to wind up our conversation here. Man, there are many other threads that I would love to have touched on. In particular, we started going down a little bit of a rabbit hole there when it comes to some of the maybe the key pillars, the important pieces of the puzzle when it comes to storytelling. And a question perhaps for another conversation, which I'm sure some listeners tuning in would love to hear as well, is how do we get better at storytelling? And we did touch on a couple of the threads there, but I would love to go much deeper, but perhaps for another day amongst many other things.
Well, let me just say very quickly,
please,
that is the first step to true speech is listening. So if you want to become a good storyteller, you tune your ear to myth, as Martin would say. Begin listening to stories and travel with them. Don't be in a rush to tell them. Do them the justice. Spend some time with them.
Yeah.
Listen.
That's such an important addition as well, because we live in such a fast-paced, rapid, give it to me now, immediate gratification culture, as we know that we have that inclination to jump from one thing to the next. We're always chasing rather than really sitting and, to use the language that we have used a couple of times, really, really sitting with something, really beholding it, really taking it to heart and courting it, as you say, and many of the other, the great storytellers and mythologists say. But for now, we have touched on this, but I'll let you speak to the listeners directly. Is there anywhere in particular that you'd like to direct people so they can follow more of your work and more of your projects? And if you feel called, you can also mention some of the projects that you do have brewing and simmering in the Cauldron of Mystery.
Yeah, I won't speak too much about what's brewing because it requires a certain privacy at the moment. But what I can say is that there's some beautiful things in the brew. And the way for anyone who is interested in what I'm talking about and might be interested to know more at this stage is just to give me a follow on Facebook or Instagram. And in the coming weeks and months, these things will have taken full form, and they will appear. And then, if it calls to you, then just follow the threads. That would be my invitation to the listeners. I'm not a tech savvy guy. I don't have a website. I don't have a podcast or all these places where people can find me. I've been out in the wilderness guiding for over a decade. And I'm just coming to recognize that it's time, as I've spoken about earlier, to kind of take my own medicine and come to the center and find platforms and ways to share some of the wisdom I've gathered and continue to do so in my studies at the moment through mythology and the oral tradition and poetry.
Perfect. I'll make sure the links so that people can find you are in the show notes to this episode, Leon. And look, lastly, just as we opened up the space, this has been another thread throughout Birdsong, and it is that I would love for you to share some words to formally close the container that we've co-created, in opening, honoring the sacred in one way or another, whether it's a prayer, a poem, a short story, something for us to sit with as we go about our day, or even as simple as some loving words or gratitude, as you wish.
Yeah, well, let's not overlabor it, and let's just say, 100,000 thank yous to all the listeners, all the ones we can see, all the ones we can't see, all the ones who stand behind us, those whose shoulders we stand upon. We hope that we did good by you. We hope we did good. We hope our words were truthful, were sincere, were honest. We hope our words nourish the hearts and the minds of those who are listening, and not just the human ears, but all manner of things that are listening in on this conversation. And we thank you for your presence here and supporting us in this conversation. And for now, you're free until we invite you back in. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Beautiful, brother. Thanks once again for joining me here on Birdsong today.
Pleasure, mate.